IFF is a nonprofit community development finance institution that was started in Chicago in 1988 out of the Chicago Community Trust. So we're one of the few CDFIs that works beyond just a lending capacity and works to support transformational community development across the Midwest. We have offices in Chicago, Indianapolis, Milwaukee, St. Louis, and Detroit, and we have partnership offices in Cincinnati and Minneapolis. And what's really core to our philosophy is to support transformational community development, and as Katie pointed out, to support data-driven decisions. And we're particularly excited about the Colina Foundation, the Community Foundation of Southeast Michigan, the Kellogg Foundation, and the Kresge Foundation making an investment in the establishment of this baseline data. So all of us working broadly to support comprehensive community development in Southeast Michigan have tools to be able to drive those decisions. So just briefly, our primary work is in lending. We've provided over 1,200 loans across the entire Midwest. Our office in Michigan opened in January of last year, and since that time we've put $24 million on the street in Michigan. We have loans in Marquette, Muskegon, Flint, Grand Rapids, all over Southeast Michigan, including more than $13 million in the city of Detroit, and that spans everything across the nonprofit sector. In 1997, we realized that nonprofits were doing really good work at what they did every day, but when they encountered a facilities project, typically that work fell on the shoulders of senior leadership or board with mixed results. So in 1997, we created a real estate services consulting group. Here in Detroit, with support from the Skillman Foundation, we have a full-service real estate office focused on helping nonprofit organizations throughout Southeast Michigan make informed facilities decisions and help them achieve their facilities goals, including in the area of early childhood education. Research has been a cornerstone of our work since our inception. Our research work actually extends nationwide and is focused in the areas of early childhood and quality needs assessments for schools within the K-12 sector. And my colleague, Dr. Jovita Baber, who'll be doing the bulk of the presentation today, leads that department, and she's here from Chicago. At the intersection of these three programs, we really see something called community strategies, which is the idea of taking data and taking these tools in addition to work to support policy, bringing them together and moving conversations forward in communities. And that brings us to kind of this wraparound in terms of the public policy conversation. And the conversations I've had with many of you, we want to reiterate today, is to take this baseline data as a baseline for Southeast Michigan. We'll lend our voice to the efforts to support programmatic quality, to support providers, to support building the bench. And then we're going to focus our core competencies in the areas facilities and finance. But it's our hope that we can work with philanthropy, providers, and stakeholders to help make sure we have a robust and productive early childhood education system in Southeast Michigan that reflects the dignity of the children in those programs, the dignity of the people who work in those programs, and the dignity of people who are part of those communities every single day, because that's what everybody deserves. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jovita to start running us through the methodology, and she's going to spend a little bit of time on this to make sure everybody gets that part thoroughly understood, and we'll go from there and open it for questions over the course of the presentation. So.
Thank you very much, Kirby. And thank you all for coming out. I greatly appreciate it. What we do in a very basic way is this is a supply and demand needs assessment. So we're looking at supply, meaning where are the centers and how many children can they accept. And then we look at the demand side, which is how many children are there. And then we take that and we subtract one from the other in order to find a service gap. So on a very basic level, that's what we do. To complicate it a little bit further, as you know, life is more complicated than that, in that not all centers can provide services to all children because it depends on the type of funding stream and business model of that center. So supply then is very much shaped by who that community, or who that center is serving and who's in the community that is accessing that. So we break down supply then on a very lower program level, and where we look at supply in regards to early Head Start and Head Start, we look at subsidized care or CDC, we look at Great Start, we look at market rate, and understand the supply in those various programs. Similarly, when we're looking at demand, we then take the math and figure out exactly how many kids that are eligible for Head Start are in each community. How many kids eligible for early Head Start, Great Start, et cetera, and the programs, and then market level. And so we look at it on a macro level, saying how much need is there broadly, and then on the programmatic level. So you will see once you are looking at the full report that it has data on those levels. Today, we're going to focus mostly on the macro level, but I'll spend a little bit of time on early Head Start and Head Start because of the purpose of this particular meeting. But we'll stay mostly on the macro level because I want you to understand the study and how to access the data. And you will have, again, in that USB, the flash drive, the information you need to dig in a little bit deeper. So let's look a little bit further when it comes to demand. In the Tri-County area, and when I'm going to, for shorthand, just call it Tri-County, but please keep in mind that unless I say region, when I say Tri-County, I'm referencing Macomb, Oakland, and Outwayne. Okay, so I'm not including Detroit when I say Tri-County because we did 2 studies as was mentioned earlier. So in the Tri-County area, there's about 206,000 children. As you know, not all of those children are going to place demand on the system because some of them are going to have mothers that stay home and take care of them, or grandmas or aunties, or the neighbor that they work out an arrangement and the neighbor helps take care of them. So we know that not all those children are going to need services, and we know proportionally who's going to need services. And the way we know that is there's some surveys that have been done on a national level. We isolated out Midwestern metropolitan areas in terms of the respondents in order to look at the patterns based on socioeconomics, family composition, and what I mean by that is single parent versus 2-parent, and employment status. And as you can probably imagine, that 2 parents where one is working and the others stay at home demands daycare less or early ed less than single parent that is working 2 jobs, right? Those are very different types of demands, and so our demand numbers reflect that. So if you look at this, you'll see that the top part is the white part, those are all the people of that 206 that are not going to make demand. The gray part are those that are going to have a demand on the system. And when you think about demand on the system, then we have to start saying, so what kind of demand? Because there's demand based on age. We already have it broken down 0 to 2, 3 to 5. But then there's demand based on socioeconomics and work status. So let's take a look here. Head Start and Early Head Start, the proxy that we use in order to establish that demand line is 100% federal poverty level. And so we make the assumption that all children under 100% poverty level ought to have access to Early Head Start and Head Start. The next demand cutoff point is 125% federal poverty level. So when we talk about CDC eligibility, and we want to just isolate those numbers because we don't want the overlap, we will talk about just that gray zone in there between the 100 to 125%. And then there's demand on Great Start. So of that 125%, Great Start is to serve children between 100% and 200% federal poverty level. So we isolate the 4-year-olds within that space in order to get at where the demand is. So going back again, you have 206,000 children overall. 129,000 of those children are likely to place a demand on the system in some way or another. And then within that, there are pockets based on the types of programs and funding available and eligibility to access those that then helps us to isolate and figure out what the demand is overall. So we pair that then with how do we do supply. We look at, and we took some child level data looking at where children live in relationship to where they access services. And what we found is we found a radius that was pretty classic of how far people travel. It was the 50% mark. And then we essentially take the center, as you'll see here. This is an example on this side of how we figure out supply, is that at the center where the star is where that center would be located. And then if you draw a typical radius of how far people tend to commute in order to access a center, you see the radius or the darker gray circle around it. So then we have our geographies or communities, and we proportion the amount of service to each of those communities based on how much overlap there are and the density of children within that space. So you can see here that about 2% is going to that community, 18% there, 80% to the primary community. Then if you visualize that and project it on taking all the centers at the same time within our computer program and have it disperse all those different providers over space to figure out where that supply is taking place, it looks like this. So essentially then, if we, to go back to our simple formula, as you can see there's a lot more complexity in it, but we take those demand numbers against the supply numbers broadly, and then we take it very specifically to say, what's the supply and demand for early Head Start? What's the supply and demand for Head Start within this space? And we're able then to get at the specificities of what's the market look for each of those programs. So this is just quickly, you probably know this information already, but I just want you to have this map in your head as we go through and look at where the demand is. You'll see here that the denser spots are the higher density of children from 0 to 5. And then as you go out, it becomes lighter because it is not as dense. And then you'll see that section in Oakland right there where it's not as dense, sort of in the middle. And that's an important one that we're going to come back to that space and talk about that. And so similarly, this doesn't exactly reflect that. The density of children that are below 100% federal poverty level, which is the marker point that we are using and is a pretty good proxy for talking about eligibility for early Head Start and Head Start. And you can see where the density of this exists also. So here's the data when you look at the entire region. So this includes Detroit, these particular numbers. So when you look at the entire region, total children are 261, so that's the top of that histogram that we showed earlier. Of that broken down, there's about 135,000 children that are 0 to 2, and about 127,000 children that are 3 to 5. Then looking, once you use the multiplier to figure out how many of those children are actually likely to place a demand on the system, then it gets narrowed down to 74,000 children that are 0 to 2, about 100,000 that are 3 to 5, and for a total of 174,000. And you can see here, which I think is, I just will point it out quickly, is that the difference for 0 to 2 in terms of the demand, there's a little bit less demand. Mothers particularly are more likely to stay at home or to have an auntie or a grandmother take care of them. The demand very much does increase at 3 to 5. But in a moment you'll see that the supply is very low at 0 to 2. We might overassume the number of mothers that are staying home potentially, or fathers staying home to care, right? So the available licensed and registered slots, there's about 15,000 for 0 to 2. There's 91,000 for 3 to 5, meaning there's about 105,000, 106,000, which then overall leaves a gap of about 69,000 spaces that are needed if we were to have every child in a registered home or licensed center. And as I was referencing, so about 87% of that overall gap is at the 0 to 2. And 13% is at the 3 to 5. So 3 to 5, when you look at the entire region, and that's important, when you look at the entire region, 3 to 5 has reasonable coverage and actually has better coverage than we sometimes see. And I'm going to give you a little bit of a foreshadowing maybe, in that Oakland has an excess of seats. And so you will see in a moment that despite the fact that it looks fairly well covered, you still have significant gaps in other places in Wayne County and Macomb. Here are the top 13 highest need areas that are in the Macomb, Oakland, and Wayne counties, and the top 10 within Detroit. So ultimately, that is what we try to demonstrate to people, is this is where the highest need neighborhoods are, where there is many children that don't have access, or there isn't sufficient seats to serve them. Now, of course, as is really important to keep in mind, this is saying there's space to build. That's a very different strategy than saying, hey, there's enough seats there, but we don't yet know the quality of those seats. And we want to encourage quality within this other space. So just because these are the highest need areas certainly doesn't mean there's nothing to do anywhere else or it's not worth investing resources elsewhere. There are other things that need to happen in other spaces, right? Specifically around Great Start to Quality and encouraging people to participate so that we can all get a sense and raise that bar. What does the highest need neighborhoods tell us? What's nice about the analytics is that I'm just going to run right over to here and look at this number, 55%. 55% of the children who do not have easy access, or the families that do not have easy access to a center within a reasonable radius or a normal commute radius, would be served if you focus on these communities. So in other words, it allows you to look at the breadth of the geography and say, here's where we really need to focus to have an impact. So among the high need communities, there's about 77,000 children. There's about 57,000 that are likely to place demand on the system, about 19,000 available licensed and registered homes with slots, and there's about 38,000 seats that are still needed in order to fully serve those children in licensed and registered slots. And so that is 39% of the overall need in 0 to 2 is located in these top highest need areas. Now that 159% is just intuitively difficult to wrap your head around. So I want to pause for a minute and talk about that. What this is saying is that when you look overall at the gap is not that big when you look at the full region. And again, it's because, as I said earlier, Oakland actually has a surplus of seats. When you have a surplus of seats and then you average that into the areas that have huge gaps in seats, then there's not as much of a gap. But what happens is when you identify those spaces that have significant gaps, you then get a number that just looks strange. So let me go back for 1 minute just to explain this further. If you look at the entire region, there's a gap of about 9,000 seats in the entire region. And I said there's 13% overall gap is there. There's fairly good coverage if you only think at that macro level, right? But then when you narrow it down, you realize that it's 9,000 across the region, but that's because there's communities that have a surplus. And when I say surplus, that probably is the wrong word, because I would venture to guess, and I don't know this until I go house to house and ask every parent, are you sending your child and reconstruct the surveys that look at this type of work. But I would venture to guess that in Oakland, among families that have 3 to 5-year-olds, that there's a higher portion of them that are accessing and getting their kids into quality education programs, that those slots aren't sitting there vacant, I would venture to guess. That they're being filled because the demand is higher, because the families tend to be of higher means. Once you take Oakland out of the picture, you begin to really see the gap, and that gap then looks more like 14,000 within these concentrated areas as opposed to the 9,000 across the region. So here then is just looking at Tri-County area, meaning not Detroit, taking Detroit out of the picture. So then you have 205 or 206,000. You can read it, so I'm not going to go through every data point here. There's 129,000 children that are likely to demand, 88,000 that are available slots in licensed and registered providers. There's a gap of 41,000. And the majority of the gap is very much in that 0 to 2 range. And again, that 4% is very much related to so much service for 3 to 5 within the Oakland area. And so you're going to see a very startling number over here, but it's when you then take the need of Detroit out and concentrate it that you then see that gap even further. So here's what the Tri-County area looks like in terms of need. So you can see the number 1 community, and 2 is up to the north, 3, 4, and there's a clustering down here. And in a moment, you're going to see what was really interesting and really pushed people to want to see the full Tri-County, because when we were doing the Detroit study, many of the high need areas in Detroit were along the edges. And people said, well, those people are probably all crossing over in order to get service. But what was interesting then in doing Tri-County is just on the other side, in fact, are also high need areas. So the likelihood is that people are not accessing service in that way. They're coming up with alternative ways to fill that need. So having identified where the highest need communities are, we're able to, in this case, identify 62% of the need, that there's 25,000 seats that are needed in those 13 communities. This is just completely data rich, but it's to allow you to quickly glance across how the rating system works when you look across the various programs. So let's take East Dearborn, for example. Overall, East Dearborn is number 1. But if you look at the number of children compared to the supply for market rate slots, you'll see that it's ranked 43. So it doesn't necessarily need more market rate slots, but if you then look at the various programs that get subsidy or federal funding or state funding, you see that it's almost consistently in the top 2, subsidized at 6th, Great Start it's 3rd, so that it has significant need in those areas. And similarly, let's take another example here where Taylor is 5th, it's 2nd in general care. So in that particular space, there's more of a need for market rate care. And if you continue across, it still has need across the others, but it's a very different type of landscape. So what it allows you to begin thinking about when you look at this, and there's much deeper data, again, it's about a 70-page document, is that it allows you then to begin to think strategically. You know, if you are doing a blended funding model, you can think, okay, where is there need for a combination of Great Start and Head Start, or subsidized care and Head Start, depending on kind of how your model functions, or early Head Start and Head Start, and where do we find the density of where that need might be if we're going to expand and place our centers there. And this allows you, it's not presented in this way, this really is to allow you to see it in this point in time here, but it's broken down by neighborhood at the end of the study, and then within the study you get maps that illustrate each of these. Looking at numbers for Detroit, there's 56,000 children, 46,000 of them are in need of care or likely to place demand. 18,000 slots are currently available, which leaves a gap of 27,000. And here then is the updated map. As was pointed out, we did this study originally for Kresge using 2013 data. This is using 2015 data. So it's after the rebidding process in order to incorporate that, and some expansion with Great Start within that area. And there was a little bit of shifting, but fundamentally the picture is the same. And when we talk about high need, you are always going to have some people moving in, some people moving out. A center comes, it shifts it ever so slightly. But from 2013 to 2015, phenomenal work was done. And you know, there were many more slots that were created, but there's so much to do that it didn't really make a huge impact in terms of looking at the macro view of what's going on in Detroit. And so we saw a little bit of shifting, but essentially the neighborhoods that were in the top 14 remained in the top 14, but there was a little bit of movement that 2 dropped out and 2 came in, but they still are largely the same. And I always say to people, you know, we're living in a living, breathing program and system. And so when you look at the data, I think one of the misleading things in looking at data is people are like, there, it's that, it's data, it's done, and you know, and it's in print. And then they don't get that was yesterday, and today 10 people moved out and a center opened, and it is constantly shifting and moving. So I do want to say right now, whether you're looking at this data or actually any data, is that you have to build into your thinking the flexibility of saying, I'm not saying, and certainly I don't know anyone that would say, let's all focus on number one and then move to number two. I think that what this data tells us is these are areas where there's significant need. And next year it's going to shift ever so slightly, but probably in the next 5 years it's not going to be so dramatic because of the need. It's not going to be so dramatic that this couldn't be used to build a 5-year strategic plan on how to begin to address need, but thinking of it in a broad way, both thinking about quality as well as thinking about slots. And I could say the same thing when we looked at the Tri-County, so it certainly applies to what I said previously. Going then to Detroit, those highest need, those 10 neighborhoods, have about 45% of the overall demand. And you'll see that here, these proportions are more the type that we tend to see as opposed to 620% of the demand is located in 13 cities. Here it's 36 and 70%, and that's because there's a little bit more evenness, for good or for bad. There's a little bit more evenness in terms of the gap across Detroit. You don't have a huge surplus area and then a huge deficit area in terms of service gap. And so you get more intuitive looking numbers. Here's the map for the service gap overall for 0 to 2. Here's the map for general care, which better labeling would be is really market care. So this is where there is need for centers that are charging a market rate that do not have subsidized programs within them. Here's for subsidized care, or CDC, and 0 to 2. And then this is early Head Start. And you'll see in all these maps there's a pattern. As I said, there's going to be a little bit of shifting depending on the type of center and the population and the type of program and who's there. But the density of need very much hovers around certain neighborhoods with a little bit of shifting here and there. Here's the overall service gap for 3 to 5. This is the market rate service gap. The density is much more down in the southwestern portion. Here's subsidized care. There's a little bit of shifting up into the north. And then here's the Head Start map. This one looks a bit different than the other ones in terms of it goes a little bit more northerly than some of the other maps. And this is the Great Start. If you look at this, so this is Pontiac, and then up here I put in, up here is East Dearborn. And so this is with narrative. There's about 2 pages of narrative that are available. If you look at this though, you'll see at the very top in this map, each of the centers that exist are on the map. They are sized by the number of slots that they have, and they are colored by the star rating system. And so if they are gray, light gray, they're licensed and registered, but they don't have a rating. If they're unlicensed, they're a dark gray. So this goes back to do we have the unlicensed CDC homes? We don't have all unlicensed homes because they're under the radar. But we do have the data set of the unlicensed homes that are receiving a check. And so they are in dark gray on all these maps. And then you'll see that 3 stars is yellow, which is the basic entry, right, for GSRP, and then going up to the dark green, which is the 5 stars. You'll also see that we put on here the SMART and the DDOT bus routes so that you can also see the relationship between public transportation and where the centers are, and just thinking strategically about where a center might be. And then if you look at to the top, meeting the need, that first table right at the top, sort of toward the center, you'll see that it has the ranking in a bit nicer way than what you saw on that huge slide, but it gives you the ranking for each of the program types and the service gap and the service level within that program and for each respective age group. And so if you were to look down for early Head Start, and for Head Start, East Dearborn is second for both of them, and they have a fairly large gap for each of them. The early Head Start has 0% service level. Head Start has a 4% service level. If you look at the population characteristics, then it gives you information based on language, race and ethnicity, poverty, so that you can, as a baseline, begin to think about who is this community and does our model fit the community. And one of the recommendations we have, which I'm sure all of you very much know, is the importance of not only having the right program in place for the community, but recognizing the impact of culturally aware curriculum when you're interacting with the community. And understanding the way in which you culturally welcome families into your center or go out into the community to recruit families to your center. That understanding the demographics isn't just about, obviously, do they fit into the program or not, but understanding the linguistic diversity, race, ethnicity, et cetera. So we do provide that data because it plays an important role in whether you're successful within that community. And I see lots of heads shaking, so I'm clearly speaking to those who already know. In terms of demand and supply, again, it gives you a breakdown of demand and supply, and then the unlicensed slots within the community. We set that aside because people often want to know. So here are the ones, the larger table here are the slots that are counted toward calculating supply, right? And so these are the ones that allow us to say this is how many slots are available at this type of cutoff that we have created. But we wanted to put the information for the unlicensed because that also gives you information. How many unlicensed families are providing CDC care? This is a lot of information, but I do hope that it at least prompts you to open up the USB, recognize there's a lot of data in there that can be used in your upcoming reports or bids, and to dive in, and to certainly contact us if you saw the many things that we can assist with, whether it's a little bit more data or you need to pull things. And of course, Data Driven Detroit is here. I'm sure that they would love to assist too. So you have many resources to go to in terms of thinking about data. And then we also would be happy to assist you in any of the other ways that capacities that IFF has. Feel free to reach out if you need me at all.
We made 5 recommendations out of the Detroit study. 3 of them were policy recommendations and 2 were facilities and finance related. So the 3 policy recommendations were to increase participation in the Great Start to Quality rating system, to encourage families and providers to move to a blended funding model so that when families were seeking care, they had access for a one-stop shop, essentially, kind of a birth to school age model. It's, number one, more financially feasible, but number 2, it also provides a better, more certain full service option for families. And the third policy one was to, in order to enable those first 2 things, was to continue to make investments in providers, right? Providers need access to better technology, they need access to a bench with finance capacity to be able to manage the blended funding model, and they need access to just strong supports to help the providers be able to provide their programs. Our 2 facilities recommendations were, 1, embark on a facilities renovation program on behalf of providers, and 2 was to support the creation of at least 3 state-of-the-art family resource centers in the city of Detroit. The W.K. Kellogg Foundation picked up on the first of the 2 facilities options I mentioned, and so right now IFF is currently underway in the city of Detroit, focusing on some early analysis of facilities. We were pretty optimistic in terms of what we'd be able to do in that first year, and then we're taking it back a little bit in terms of the scale and scope of the issue. So what we're trying to do now, and we've already shared this in partnership with philanthropy with Region 5, is to really try and tell the story of facilities in Detroit. It's not at this point down to the site-by-site level, but it's to create kind of a map that summarizes the conditions that exist within the city of Detroit around facilities. We have shared with Region 5 probably 9 to 12 key findings around facilities. We're working on aggregating an inventory that looks at what is the average cost per square foot that providers pay, what's the particular tenure of providers, do they lease, do they own, what do those leases typically look like, and what are some of the significant facilities challenges. It's our hope that we can use that information to try and help support providers going to Region 5, to philanthropy and other stakeholders, to support investments in facilities, because it's been something that's not been on the radar screen in the same way. We had hoped to be able to get much more specific. Right now it's really summarizing the landscape, but working hand in hand with providers to be advocates with Region 5 and with philanthropy and other stakeholders about the importance of high quality facilities. Our desire would be to expand that beyond the city of Detroit and to look at the TriCounty area. One of the things we all know, we know that this is the case, there are many programs that are high quality in spite of their space, right? We want to support high quality programs. And so for many cases, as Jovita pointed out, there's a strategy for every neighborhood. Sometimes it's not increasing the supply. Sometimes it's helping support that provider, improve that facility, or in some cases actually having more certainty, right? Going from a 1-year to 1-year lease provides a lot of uncertainty both for the provider and for the families. And there might be ways in which we can address stability in communities by making sure we make investments in providers, that they have what they need to focus on their programs and stay strong within that particular community.
What will happen specifically with this data in Detroit really depends on whether it's going to remain a point in time or people want ongoing work. And certainly we're still very open to figuring out, local partnerships around what that might look like.
And you remember we were at a point in time before the conversion for the early Head Start slots, and so the number was abysmally low. It's still abysmally low, but it's exponentially better than it was, right? The other issue, I think, is this question about participation in the Great Start to Quality rating system. That is a living, breathing thing, and those numbers change all the time, particularly for providers that are in recertification. Their status moves a little bit. So to this point, we're very sensitive of the fact that it's a point-in-time analysis and very aware of the importance of sometimes having people feel comfortable that the data does get updated so that we can have conversations that say, that's great, we went to Lansing, we advocated for this, and that there's been significant change. However, the need is still so significant, we have to all work together to support policy changes and efforts. And so I think, as Jovita points out, we're certainly open to it and we see the importance of it, and we want to keep saying over and over that this is a point-in-time analysis and the numbers may be slightly different than what you're seeing on a real-time basis, and it underscores the importance, I think, of our community deciding what kinds of tools the provider community needs and stakeholders need and philanthropy needs to make decisions, and then participating together to support that effort. Because whether it's a focus on facilities or quality, or Dr. Price again this morning brought up the idea of how do we support high quality teachers and making sure we get the right certifications, another important issue, certainly not something we even was part of this conversation. So we want the community to come together and start to decide what information is valuable and important, and how do we use that information to help support policy and investment decisions. For specific questions around methodology, or if you want to drill down on geography, particularly given some of the timelines that you're working with to help respond to some of these RFPs that are open, it's probably best if we connect you with some of our folks in our Chicago office. So for these very specific questions about a nuance in a geography, or specific questions around some of the methodology, it's going to be the most efficient if we get you connected to Jovita and her team. We are available here locally. Certainly you know who we are and where to find us. But we want to make sure that for this kind of specific question, especially because a number of you are dealing with tight timelines, and you might have a very nuanced question around your geography, that we get you to the research folks, because they're going to be able to go down to some of the source data and get you some of the answers that you might need in a way that's probably more expeditious and accurate than we could provide.
So you can write down our email address now if you want. So thank you very much.